Okay.
good to save as much time as we can.
Right.
Yeah.
Good evening, everybody, and I welcome co-chairperson Dr. Riti Saini and moderator Dr. Harpreet Kapoor, and I welcome all the speakers. Well, Professor G.N. Rao used to say that extraordinary is little more than extra. And we have Dr. Sujata, who has always been extraordinary. And as usual, she is going to tell us something in depth about recurrent chalazion. So let's see what Dr. Sujata has to say about it. Dr. Sujata, please. Okay, then we go on to the next one, and we can ask Dr. Sujata to speak later. Our next speaker is Dr. Parul Chawla, and she is going to speak on Porbio nomogram, prediction of probability of rubella based on eye outcomes. Dr. Parul Chawla Gupta, please.
Rupeshri, can you play the presentation?
Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll be presenting the Porbio nomogram, which is a prediction of probability of rubella based on eye outcomes. So rubella is an important infectious vaccine-preventable etiology of congenital defects with disabling and life-threatening manifestations like miscarriage, congenital birth defects, and stillbirths. Rubella vaccination administered to the pregnant woman preconceptionally helps in almost 100% prevention of transmission from mother to fetus. Lack of initiation of rubella vaccination in many developing countries makes it one of the leading causes of blindness, deafness, with an estimated incidence of 1 lakh children being born with congenital rubella syndrome or CRS in a year. CRS comprises of sensorineural hearing loss, brain damage, heart malformations, and ophthalmic features like cataract, glaucoma, retinopathy, microphthalmos, and microcornea. At the level of primary and secondary healthcare centers, where larger populations are routinely catered, it is plausible that the rubella cases could be overlooked and hence the treatment not initiated. Though evaluation of ENT signs and heart malformations requires a trained physician, assessment of ocular signs is relatively easy and signs like cataract are seen as a white reflex, microphthalmos seen as small eye, microcornea seen as small cornea, and these all could be easily identified by an accredited social health worker or an ASHA worker, even using a torchlight. Hence, we planned to develop a prediction nomogram based on the data acquired from multi-center surveillance sites to assess the probability of an infant being at risk for congenital rubella based on demographics and ophthalmological findings. So the aim of our study was to develop a prediction nomogram to assess the probability of an infant being at risk for congenital rubella based on demographics and ophthalmological findings. This was a cross-sectional sentinel surveillance study conducted at 5 centers spanning pan-India between November 2016 and December 2019 and involved 1,134 infants. The diagnosis of rubella was made using standard guidelines given by WHO. For construction of prediction model, laboratory confirmed cases were grouped as at-risk infants and the discarded cases into not at-risk infants. Univariate analysis followed by multivariate binary logistic regression model development was performed. So now we come to the case definitions. Suspected CRS consisted of any of the following in an infant: structural heart defect, PDA and PFO in an infant less than 37 weeks were excluded. Hearing impairment, eye signs like cataract, microphthalmia, microcornea, retinopathy, and glaucoma. Maternal history of rubella infection, both suspected and confirmed, as well as a strong clinical suspicion. They all came into the category of suspected CRS. Clinically confirmed CRS, it consisted of at least 2 clinical signs in Group A and 1 sign in Group B. So what was Group A? Group A constituted of the ophthalmological signs, structural heart disease, and hearing impairment. And Group B consists of microcephaly, delay in development, splenomegaly, purpura, radiolucent bone disease, meningoencephalitis, and jaundice within 24 hours of birth. Clinically compatible case consists of signs and symptoms of CRS, but for which a blood sample could not be obtained. Laboratory confirmed CRS consists of one of the following conditions in group A, along with detection of rubella IgM antibody or sustained detectable IgG antibody as detected at 2 time points, 1 month apart, in the absence of a history of administration of rubella vaccine. Congenital rubella infection is an infant who has a positive rubella IgM test, but there is absence of any clinical sign from group A. Discarded case consists of negative serological result for rubella, irrespective of the clinical signs. So, discussing the results, the average age of the suspected CRS infants was 3 months, and the average age of their mothers was 25.8 years. Out of the total infants, 7.3% died, 88% were alive, and around 5% were lost to follow-up. In our patients with laboratory confirmed CRS, congenital heart anomalies and eye anomalies were the most commonly detected defects. So this was a forest plot depicting the odds ratio along with 95% confidence interval of the developed multivariate binomial logistic regression model. And the final model showed that the odds of cataract, retinopathy, glaucoma, microcornea, and age of the infant at presentation are 3.1, 4.9, 2.7, 2.3, and 1.1 respectively for the at-risk infant as compared to the not at-risk infant. So retinopathy was 4.89, cataract was 3.07, glaucoma was lesser, microcornea was even lesser, and age of the infant one was 1.05. So this was the Porbio nomogram which we developed. This included cataract, retinopathy, glaucoma, microcornea, age of the child, and these were the total points. And this signified the probability of having rubella. So according to this prediction model, let us take an example of a 6-month-old infant with cataract and retinopathy, suggestive of rubella infection. So the cataract would get a score of 35, cataract gets a score of 35, and retinopathy would get a score of 50. Since the total score according to the nomogram would be 85, that is 35 plus 50, 85, which would predict a probability of having rubella of more than 0.6. So it will be 85, 35 plus 50, and that will be more than 0.6 probability. So what were the advantages of this web server? The advantages were that the development of the web server would help in the external validation of the model by pediatricians, ophthalmologists, ophthalmic assistants, and ophthalmic technicians. It could even help policymakers in taking a decision. This web server could be used by the far-flung rural areas where sophisticated high-end equipment is unavailable. And to the best of our knowledge, no such nomogram has been designed to date. So to conclude, we created a prognostic and predictive nomogram with various ophthalmological clinical characteristics of a child with suspected congenital rubella. If the probability of rubella diagnosis could be quantified with ophthalmological examination, it would help immensely in enforcing more care to those selected infants with higher risk, which will subsequently help in follow-up visits. The developed nomogram would have a wide community-based utilization, and it will help in prioritizing attention to high-risk children and thereby avoiding loss to follow-ups. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Parul. Dr. Ashok, Dr. Reeti, any questions at this point? Or it seems Dr. Sujata is having some trouble connecting in. So I'm told I will kind of, I'll just make my presentation after this. But in the meantime, if you would want to ask something, any clarifications, queries?
I think we should congratulate Dr. Parul Chawla for excellent study and a very good nomogram, which as she herself explained, will be very useful for policymakers and also for the follow-up of the patients who are at risk. So that is an excellent study. Is Dr. Sujata ready? Can we have some? Okay, Dr. Harpreet, can you please go ahead with your presentation? Yes, you are audible. Your screen is visible.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Very good afternoon to all again. And well, today I'll be touching upon a subject which is largely unaddressed by our fraternity. And even though there are legal frameworks around it, but yet I think inclusion is largely excluded, I would say, within our ophthalmic fraternity, and not even just ophthalmology, even the medicine, even medical fraternity at large. And inclusion has started to be recognized as an area which needs to be addressed, and if there are even legal frameworks around it globally and in our country as well. Okay, now this is a common scenario which we come across in our day-to-day lives. It is a patient with cataract blindness, and when such a patient comes to us, we are often, deliberating even in conferences, workshops regarding, how best can we give good vision, eagle vision rather, to our patient. Should I do a femto or trifocal? Which is the best IUL? What fluidics would we be kind of, looking into? However, then there is the other end of the spectrum here. When a patient, say, presents to you with retinitis pigmentosa or bilateral optic atrophy, and the patient has lost his vision permanently, and here is a patient with incurable blindness. So what is your immediate response? It's usually, sorry, nothing can be done for you. However, we do not realize that making such a statement is kind of extremely devastating for the patient, and it seems to be the end of the road for him or her. So we should be very careful when we make such statements, because this is not the end of the road. If we can't do anything, there are yet other people who can do something for the person. So it would be good to say that, okay, I cannot do anything, but yes, we can refer such a patient to the right center or organization. So I'll be talking about inclusion in eye health. Well, what does inclusion really mean? It is about leaving no one behind, which is one of the main agendas of the Sustainable Development Goals 2030. And essentially, we mean that people with disabilities benefit as much from an eye care service as any other individual. So it is about strengthening our services so that people with permanent visual disability and then others with physical disability, say a hearing impairment or intellectual impairment, benefit as much as any other individual would. Now here I don't mean that we go ahead and set up a ortho, ENT or neuro service in our center, but it is just about making those small changes so that people with disability can access your quality services independently. Here, I would like to stress on independent, because it is about a rights-based approach. CPM encourages a rights-based approach to disability, and this has been actually ratified by the UNCRPD Article 25 in 2006, and 163 member states have already adopted this, and it is kind of a legal framework now, and which our country is also a part of. So then, if I were to just, share a few WHO facts, and especially the World Report on Vision, which was published in 2019, and some of the global facts, which are some figures are staggering, actually. So it has been seen that there are about 2.2 billion people in the world who have a visual impairment or blindness. And amongst these, 1 billion haven't been addressed. Of course, the numbers are huge, because most of them, around 826 million, I've seen are presbyopia. That is also included here. That's why the numbers are looking so huge. But then amongst these numbers, it has been seen that majority of these belong to marginalized groups, and especially people with disability. Now, if we see some facts from the Disability and Health Report of WHO, it says that 15% of global population has a disability. And then yet another staggering statement, I would say, is that almost everyone is likely to experience some form of disability, temporary or permanent, at some point of life. So this is what kind of hits your mind. So it's not always that you are talking about people on the other side of the fence. So even if disability is temporary, it kind of limits your movement and say, your access to various services. So we need to be sensitized about the same. So how do we make our services inclusive really? So the first step is about identifying the barriers which exist in our services. Now, one of the key barriers, actually some of the most important ones, are attitudinal, communication, physical access, then the availability of services. I'm talking about low vision services especially, and even affordability. Now, the first and foremost, I've put attitudinal at the top because that is the key barrier, which if addressed, I think the others will automatically fall in place and will get taken care of. And the second important piece is about how we communicate with our patients. That is very crucial to ensure that people with disability access our services and are able to independently move around and get the best out of it. Here, I would just like to share a small video from Edward. Okay, that was Edward from Storm Eye Institute, and So just a quick video I thought we could fit in. We usually have around 2 days long workshops that I'm trying to fit in as much as possible within these 10 minutes. And okay, so the next important, the first one was attitude, the second communication, the third is about physical access. So how do we, so once we've recognized certain areas where which need to be ramped up, so then we can address those. But then of course, some of these infrastructure changes across you can take care of only when you're actually building a new setup. But then some things like signages, that's very important. Have signages there. And in fact, it has been seen that when you kind of bring in some changes, say have important signages for facilities, your glaucoma care, retina, registration counter, you're not just addressing needs of people with disability, but that also improves the quality of your facility, the services you are imparting to any other individual. So these are some of the pictures from CBM supported organizations, which we have helped in developing them into inclusive eye care centers. The one on left is the Lahan Eye Hospital, which is known for Dr. Henig's fishhook technique in 6. So this is the one which he had set up way back in 1980s. And then this is one hospital in Indonesia, and with support, we could kind of, set up these other features, like say having a high contrast line on the floor, which kind of can help people with visual impairment reach the area where they want to. Or the other one on the right, you can see a pediatric eye care facility which was set up, and with these line markings for wayfinding in the pediatric setup. And in fact, besides supporting organizations for building up comprehensive care and capacity building for offering services in cataract, which is the need of the hour, but CBM also supports certain specialties. So this pediatric eye unit was built up, then retina, glaucoma. But then while we support this, we also encourage partners to ensure that the services are inclusive. These are pictures from some low vision services set up by CBM. And okay, and I'm also happy to announce that the Low Vision and Rehabilitation Resource Center was set up in 2015 at RP Center. and it's going up and strong. And in fact, now during COVID times also, they were able to give virtual consultations to people with disabilities. And in fact, in the now the 16 RIOs are kind of in the process of developing the low vision centers, and trainings of course are happening through RP Center. And the other one is the Shroff Eye Center here, the low vision clinic there. Okay, now last but not the least, I would say it's good to have a counseling service in your facility. Maybe the existing counselor can be trained, the person.
Ready? We'll call next.
The person who kind of, you know, is taking care of your packages, your or guiding patients otherwise, can be trained in guiding these patients, because I understand, and all of us do, that ophthalmologists, even the other staff, are too busy, you know, taking care of the workload there and in our OPDs and OTs. But then if there's a person who can spend some time and direct the person with disability to the services they require within the hospital, or say a low vision service, or any other educational or vocational rehabilitation center, it will benefit them a lot. And I would say, in one thing if COVID has taught us is to kind of, you know, just make sure you make the best of the time you have. And if you could make a difference in any other person's life, I'd say the world would be a better place to live in. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Harpreet, for giving us insight of global problem of blindness and how to take care of. And probably this is the one area which usually is overlooked in eye facilities most of the time. Thank you so much for excellent presentation. Dr. Riti, have you any comment or any question, please?
Yes, I think she has touched on a very important topic, and especially in these COVID times, you know, where discussions are also going on at the other end. Instead of having patients with disability come to you, there are talks of, you know, taking the services to the doors of the patient, and to have portable equipment where services can be given way in the periphery if the patient can't reach you. I think the other aspect of this would be, you know, when we look at that aspect also, we do include, yes, that there should be arrangements made for patients with disability to be able to access our hospitals and services easily, because they do have some kind of a mental, you know, block, and those things should be here. If they're taking care of those things in small areas like our hotels and now cinema halls and other places, I think even hospitals should have something like this. It's a very good concept, and definitely inclusive healthcare should be adopted by as many hospitals as possible.
Thank you, Dr.
We are receptive to that. I think we can make small changes, and that can make other people very comfortable, those who are not having that good vision. So that is, I think, very excellently explained. Anything?
Yeah, Dr. Ashok, thank you for that. And Dr. Riti raised a very important point. Actually, some of our organizations already have started. In fact, very recently, 2 of the organizations have a mobile eye unit, and equipment has been provided for slit lamp, fundus camera, autorefractometer in the mobile eye van, which is going from one place to the other in the remotest of the villages, and especially taking care that people with disability are reached. So, and in fact, fundus camera with AI, which are AI enabled, also are being, you know, supported. So
thank you, Dr. Harpreet. I think Dr. Sujata is ready, and let's go on to her presentation. Dr. Sujata, please. Yeah, it's visible now.
Visible now. Okay. So, very good evening to everybody. All of us routinely see patients with recurrent collision, and we treat them with conservative management or incision and curettage. But there are certain scenarios when the recurrent collision means that there is something else to it. So when this young girl of 14 years came to me with a history of recurrent redness and chalazion, and her conjunctiva was showing diffuse mild congestion, corneas were having lower part superficial vascularization with diffuse haze and mild infiltrates, they were certainly indicating something else. We know that these are the features which are suggestive of ocular features of rosacea. The girl was having skin disease known as acne rosacea or rosacea. We know that rosacea is usually seen in middle-aged females, more common in Caucasians. Pathology is both inflammatory as well as vascular. It affects the facial convexities. So cheek, nose, forehead are usually affected. Flushing is usually the first sign, means that whenever the person is exposed to sunlight or hot beverages, there is a transient erythema. Ocular manifestations are mostly seen in lids, followed by conjunctiva and cornea. So broadly, rosacea is classified into 4 varieties. First is erythematotelangiectatic, when there is only redness. Second is having papule and pustules. Third is the phimosis one, in which there we see that there is hypertrophy of the nasal skin. Fourth is the ocular rosacea, in which ocular features are visible. In ocular rosacea, it mainly affects the lid margins. Telangiectasia of lid margin is the hallmark. So we can see the lacy pattern of blood vessels. No doubt they are easily visible in Caucasians compared to our Indian patients. And the other signs of meibomitis are visible to us, like chalazion and pus-through MGO. The conjunctivitis which we see is secondary to the MGD. So we can see a diffuse hyperemia, or we can see just a focal vascular engorgement in the lower part. In cornea, the most common feature which is visible is punctate epitheliopathy. And there is peripheral superficial vascularization of the lower part. Along with that, we can see microinfiltrates. And initially, these infiltrates are perilimbal, but gradually as the disease progresses, they move towards the center. When the inflammation is too much, then the overlying epithelium gives way and they become positive on fluorescent. The disease can be asymmetrical when it's bilateral, or it can be unilateral. These spade infiltrates, these are the triangular infiltrates with the base towards the limbus, are quite characteristic of rosacea. When the same eye is getting affected at the same point, then the thinning may even cause a perforation. Like in this patient, the right eye is not affected much, but the left eye is having a small perforation. Despite being on treatment for long, perforations can happen. That's why the disease is very frustrating for both physician as well as patient. Since the main pathology is MGD, so our main treatment is directed towards lids. So we have to do the warm compresses and lid massage, and topical ointment are given. There is role of doxycycline, which can be given for 1 to 3 months, depending upon the problem. And the corneal pathology, if it is only inferior SPKs alone, lubricants can be sufficient. But if there are microinfiltrates, we need a short course of mild steroids. And in case of ulcer, we need both antibiotic and steroids. However, in this scenario, it's very essential that we are pretty sure that these are sterile infiltrates. If there is any doubt of secondary infection, scraping should be done first, and only then steroids should be started. So with this, let's go through certain practical scenarios. This young male came to us with a history of 6 months. His right eye was having watering, diminished vision. His records showed that 5 months ago, he was diagnosed as stromal keratitis. There was no staining at that time. Superficial vascularization was noted, and he was put on mild steroids and antibiotic at that time. Just after 2 months, he had a relapse. Now he had multiple infiltrates, but he consulted another place where he was considered to be a viral and started on Acivir ointment. As we can see, there was opaque secretions, central sterile looking infiltrate with leash of vessels covering it. And he gave history that he was having ocular redness since childhood. On asking, he told us that there was history of his cheeks getting red whenever he was going outside. So these signs of meibomitis, this kind of sterile infiltrate, made us diagnose it as a rosacea keratitis. We treated on those lines with antibiotic and steroid combination along with doxycycline. After a few days, warm compresses and lid massage was started. This is the picture which was visible after 6 weeks. No doubt he was asked to continue with his mevomitis treatment. A very important thing in these patients is that we need to counsel them because they can have relapse despite being on treatment. And most of the times, rosacea conjunctivitis is confused with allergic conjunctivitis, and rosacea keratitis is confused with herpetic keratitis. So in these cases, it is the skin features which are very helpful to us in making the right diagnosis. However, problem arises sometimes because the skin disease and ocular disease, they are independent of each other. And in fact, in 20% of the cases, ocular lesions come first. So we can have patients in which the disease is limited to eye alone, there are no skin features, and then it becomes a bit difficult to diagnose. Particularly happens in kids. I learned about this only when I got this young child of 5 years. He was brought with the complaint of left eye redness and discharge for last 7 days. But mother gave the history that for the last 1 year, the child is not able to open eye properly. Some ophthalmologist has diagnosed it as SPKs and started lubricants. And for the last 2 months, he was having a upper lid chalazion also. Examination in kids is always difficult, so I was not able to take a slit lamp photograph, but I could see that there is a diffuse corneal haze and multiple small peripheral infiltrates. At that time, I thought these are just the marginal keratitis, which we routinely see. I started the child on mild antibiotic steroids. Infiltrates resolved, but I could see over the follow-up that the inferior half of the cornea is very rough and which was not improving despite increasing the lubricants. It was only at this time that I thought that he might be having a rosacea keratitis. I sent the child for a skin consultation. However, there were no skin features. So I searched the literature and I came across all these articles in which they have specifically mentioned that in childhood rosacea, we can have only ocular features. So children with isolated ocular features can present to us. And in children, it can be a unilateral disease or bilateral. In my patient, it was a unilateral disease. And in all those in which the disease is persistent or having a lot of recurrences, the treatment with long-term systemic antibiotics is advised. So in some of the articles in which the disease duration was very long, they have given erythromycin even for more than an year also, initially in higher dose, then in the smaller dose. So after going through this literature, in my patient also, I started the patient on the syrup erythromycin. With this, over 2 months, I could see that his surface was better, his vision also improved. However, all the cases in kids are not easy. And good thing is that now we have oral azithromycin. So rather than erythro, we can give a single dose of azithro. And as I was talking that we can have difficult cases also, like this child, only 4 years of age. She came with a history of right eye redness of last 10 days duration, but her records were very characteristic. 2 years ago, she was diagnosed as right eye ulcerative blepharitis and a corneal flecton. Just 6 months ago, she was again diagnosed with the other eye flecton. Both these episodes were treated with steroids elsewhere. And there was this characteristic spade infiltrate in the right eye. In the left eye, she had a conjunctival flecton on the 3 o'clock position, though it's not very visible in this photograph. And she had a paracentral infiltrate in this eye also. So the right eye infiltrate was not looking sterile. So it was very important to take a scraping. Now taking a scraping under GA, that too in a COVID time when we need first initially COVID test, would have delayed the treatment a lot. So what we did that for 1 hour, we spoke to the child. So after the child was a bit friendly, I was able to take a scraping and we ruled out the fungals. And then I started the patient on antibiotic, right eye on the 12-time dose, left eye 6 times. And we started on the low dose steroid also. Since the history of recurrent flectons was there, so we wanted to rule out TB and gut infection, which can also cause flectons. And the child was not having positive Montauk, stool test was also negative. So we put this child in the category of rosacea keratitis. We started with the syrup erythromycin. However, the infiltrate was not resolving. So rather than the low dose steroid, we gave a short course of high dose steroid. And with this, the child showed improvement. And the child is doing very well now, but we have told them that mebomitis treatment will be required. So this is my last slide. So I hope that whenever next time we see any kid with a history of mebomitis or recurrent chalazion, we will take time to take the child to slit lamp and look for the features of rosacea. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Sujata, for excellent presentation and giving us the food for thought that if you have children or anybody who is with mebomitis or chalazion, do not restrict your thinking to that only. You can have something more than that. I think we will have questions or discussion in the end because we are running a little late. So we'll invite Dr. Neeti Gupta for her presentation on glycerin preserved corneas, a savior in COVID times. Dr. Neeti Gupta, please.
Hello, can you? Hello.
Yeah, you're audible and your slides are visible. Can you make it slideshow, please?
It's okay.
Yeah, it's visible. Please go ahead.
So good evening, everyone. First of all, at the outset, I would like to thank Chandigarh Ophthalmic Society and Dr. Chintan for giving me this opportunity. My topic is glycerine preserved cornea, a savior in COVID times. So we all know that corneal collection and growth of the eye banking was showing a positive trend till 2019. Until COVID-19 pandemic, it hit our nation in the later part of the January. And the impact of this COVID-19 was that it severely challenged the healthcare system worldwide, including the organ and the corneal transplant. And for life-enhancing procedures such as keratoplasty, the risk of transmitting a potentially fatal systemic disease is not acceptable. Also, there was lack of clinical data, unclear potential of the donor-derived infection, the transmission of COVID-19 through the tears or cornea, and there was not established recommendations for transplantation. This resulted in a dramatic reduction in the number of keratoplasties and donor corneas. The eye bank throughout the world, as well as in India, had discontinued the donor collection, which resulted in lack of tissues for corneal transplantation. Although elective surgeries were postponed, there was a need for emergency therapeutic and tectonic keratoplasty. And the challenge was to manage the perforations or large infiltrates, especially the one-eyed patients in the emergency. We had to fall for alternative procedures, and lot innovative techniques came during the COVID-19 to handle with these situations. But what about large perforations? So it was crucial for the eye banks to adopt methods for very long-term corneal preservation. And this is a very beautiful review article written by Chaurasia et al. In IGO, which reviews about the long-term preservation method. But most of them, they need expertise, they need technology, and they are expensive. Yet they are poor in maintaining the viability of the endothelium. So people thought of glycerine preservation of the tissues in glycerine, which many places were doing earlier also, but was since we had a good supply of fresh corneal tissue, we had forgotten this technique. So an advisory from the EBI came in 11 May 2020 to preserve all the corneal tissue in glycerine after 14 days of preservation in cortisol if it is not used. And this is not new. Glycerine preservation was first described by G.H. King et al. Using 95% glycerol under vacuum in 1955, sorry. And what was the scenario before COVID-19? In a global survey of eye banking and corneal transplant, India was labeled as almost sufficient in corneal collection. And 70% of the collection and utilization were from 6 states of India. And out of this, the overall utilization rate was 50%. That means 50% of the corneas were not used. Out of these 50%, 40% of the corneas were of non-optical grade. And therapeutic keratoplasty was the second most common type of corneal transplant, which could be performed with a non-optical grade tissue, as the primary goal of the surgery is eradication of the infection. So I had the opportunity to learn this preservation technique and use these corneas when I was a senior resident in GMC at Sector 32 under the mentorship of Dr. Sudesh Arya. And when I came to Uttarakhand, I continued this technique because the eye bank services in Uttarakhand were in a very primitive stage. The collection was not very good. So we often used to get people with corneal perforations and we didn't have fresh corneal tissue during those times. So we practiced this technique in our eye bank. So I published this article in 2017 where we reviewed, retrospectively reviewed our results. And the aim of this study was to study the outcome of corneal transplant using glycerine preserved tissue in therapeutic corneal transplants when we didn't have a fresh corneal tissue. And in this study, we found out that out of 222 penetrating keratoplasties during 2011 to 2015, we did 34 transplants with the glycerine preserved tissue, and the ocular anatomy was preserved in around 91.2%, and visual acuity of PL positive and PR accurate was obtained in 76.5% cases. So these are some of the transplant which I did in COVID times. Like in the first picture, you can see a pre-op picture of a non-healing corneal ulcer, and we didn't have tissues during that time, so we saved the eye using this glycerine preserved tissue. The third picture, pre-op picture, is of fungal keratitis not responding to the treatment, and we had to do a therapeutic transplant with a glycerine preserved tissue. This is another patient with a non-healing fungal ulcer where we did a glycerine preserved transplant. And the first state corneal, the cornea is very clear. You can see the AC details and exudates also, and the AC is very well formed. These are few of the pictures which I did transplant before, like previous to COVID. So this is one of the picture. One shows a one-eyed patient who presented to us with a perforated corneal ulcer. We saved the eye in this patient by using a glycerine preserved tissue. And then I did a retransplant with a fresh corneal tissue. The second picture is the first post-op day picture. Then unfortunately this graft failed, and then I had to do a retransplant. So the fourth picture is a 2.5 post-op picture with cataract. I did a triple procedure in this case, and the patient had a 6/12 vision, and this is the 2 years post-op picture. Another patient where we saved the eye first with a glycerine preserved tissue. Then I did a second transplant with a fresh corneal tissue. The patient developed glaucoma, so I did a trab, and then the fourth picture shows a 3.5 years post-op, post-trab patient with the best corrected visual acuity of 6/24. So then I thought of comparing this glycerine preserved tissue with a fresh corneal tissue in cases of therapeutic corneal transplant. And this paper we published in IGO in 2020, which got the Best of IGO award also this year. So here we compared the total of 94 eyes where we did a therapeutic transplant from October 2011 to 17, where 60 patients were in the fresh cornea group and 34 were in the GPC group. And the results were that the GPC was comparable to the fresh cornea group in therapeutic transplant. The primary indication, this is there was no significant difference in the therapeutic success in both the groups with a p-value of 0.741. Now, if you see here, the graft failure seen in the fresh corneal tissue group was 88%, whereas in GPC, almost all the corneas failed because the endothelium is not viable in glycerine. We did not see a single case of graft rejection in the GPC group, whereas there was 11.66% of rejections in the fresh corneal tissue group. The therapeutic success was almost comparable, slightly higher in a GPC group with 91.2% and 86.7% in the fresh corneal tissue, although this was not, the p-value was not significant. So what are the advantages of GPC? That it can be, the GPC is very easily available if we preserve all the non-optical and medically fit tissues in glycerol. And a study by Chaurasia et al. Also suggested that it can increase the donor pool by 40%. You can see in our study also the number of non-optical fresh corneal tissue used in the study was 66.7% due to paucity of good optical grade tissues. The second advantage is that it decreases the cellularity and antigenicity. So there is minimal risk of rejection. And since we are not bothered about rejection, we don't give steroids. So there is a very low risk of reinfection. Also, this decreases the cost of treatment. A study by Lee et al. Showed that the GPC was acellular in the initial 2 weeks of transplant, and later the dendritic cells and the keratocytes appear in the GPC seen on confocal microscopy. But clinically also, there was no rejection episode in the GPC group. Again, Chen et al., they compared the GPC with fresh corneal tissue group in the DALC, and they showed that rejection-free graft survival rate at 2 years was significantly higher in the GPC group as compared to the fresh corneal tissue group. The methods of preservations are many. You can preserve glycerine preservation at room temperature at -4 degrees, also at -80, whereas -80 is the best temperature method. But in our study, we preserved at -4 degree, and it is easily available in all the eye banks. So the advantages are that it is very cheap. There is no risk of transmission of infection, can be stored at room temperature or 4 degrees centigrade, can be preserved for years, for 5 years to 23 years, you can preserve this tissue. And it is very easy for transportation. There is no need for cold chain, and no technical staff or training is required. The disadvantage is that this will never serve an optical purpose, as they do not have a viable epithelium. Also, when you rehydrate this tissue, the tissue is very difficult to handle and it's quite thick. So in the left picture, you can see the thickness is 3 times that of the normal fresh cornea. Also, this tissue is totally opaque when rehydrated, so AC details are not visible during surgery. And there is a risk of delayed epithelialization, and Descemet's membrane is loose, so there is a chance of Descemet's detachment. The care while trephination is that we should wash the glycerine from the tissue before use. We should dry the Teflon block before trephination and ensure epithelial site is not slippery. Otherwise, the trephination will not be even. And this requires more pressure while trephination, as the tissue is very thick. Also, we should do all the anterior chamber manipulation before suturing of the graft. And this also requires a tight suturing, because the first day, the thickness of the graft, first post-op day, the thickness will decrease and the sutures will be loose.
So Neeti, can you summarize?
Yeah, these are last 2-3 slides. So, and the epithelial alignment is the goal, and tarsorrhaphy on the table has to be done in almost all the cases. So the potential use is tectonic keratoplasty, therapeutic keratoplasty, DALC, K-Pro, and in shunt surgeries. So to conclude, glycerine preservation is easy to implement with minimal infrastructure changes. It's comparable to the fresh corneal tissue in salvaging eyes in emergency situation when the tissues are not available, and they may be easily distributed to places where eye banking is in primitive or embryonic stage. And this also maximizes the use of the existing corneal donor pool. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Neeti, for highlighting the importance of glycerine preserved grafts. And we have been using these grafts, but I think COVID-19 has taught us to use the resources and whatever resources are available. And you rightly mentioned, for therapeutic purposes, they are equally good. Probably you have shown it better than fresh grafts. They can be used for even small patch grafts or even for DALK. So they are very useful. So we have to respect glycerine preserved grafts as corneal surgeons. We go on to the next presentation, that is by Dr. Ankit Vinayak, and that is for helping patients see at their ideal distances through CRB technology. Dr. Ankit Vinayak, please.
Yes, good evening, sir. At the outset, I would like to thank Chandigarh Ophthalmic Society for giving me this opportunity. So I would start with my talk. I'm just sharing the screen. Okay. So I hope my screen is visible to all.
Yeah, it's visible.
Okay, so I would be speaking about, we have now decent enough experience with multifocal IOLs, and my topic is basically I would be speaking on Synergy IOL, which is the latest from Johnson & Johnson. So as we all know, in today's age is the age where we call it the digital age, where there's a rapid increase in far through near vision demand. So it's an age of multitasking, where in a moment, we are at our mobile screens, and other moment we are at our laptop or desktop. So it's a continuous transition from near to intermediate to distance. So basically, that is what our patients demand sometimes. And going forward, the demand for such technology would even increase further in our practice. We've had experience with multifocals, we've had experience with trifocals so far, then we've had experience with the extended depth of focus IOLs. None of them have been able to hit the right sweet spot, which caters to all the distances without much loss of quantitative aspects of vision like contrast and color. This void, I feel, to a certain extent, is filled by Synergy, which is latest IOL from J&J. So as I said before, our experience with multifocal IOLs, has taught us that it's good or decent for near as well as distance, but there's a lot of void in the intermediate zone. So I happened to operate on a patient, who was architect by profession, and who uses his who views his drawings at a distance while standing on a table, which comes in an intermediate zone, a zone of 60 to 80 centimeter. And he was not satisfied with the multifocal IOL. Finally, I had to give him some correction for the intermediate work that he does. So that was the need for moving to trifocal IOLs to cater for the intermediate distance. So trifocals are doing very well when it comes to intermediate distance, but then there is this issue with the loss of contrast and color, and also halos. So that is where we needed something which was a combination of trifocality as well as extended depth of focus. That is a spot where Synergy has placed itself. So this slide basically tells us, in our day-to-day routine life, there is a rapid adoption of LED lighting all around us, in our house, in our clinics, and everywhere. So this LED lighting is basically creating new challenges for the qualitative aspect of vision, especially in low lighting condition. So LED lighting basically, if we study in depth, it produces a higher level of scatter due to emission of shorter violet wavelength, which is lesser than blue light. This scatter basically causes a lot of disturbance in patients who have been implanted with multifocal IOLs, so reading becomes very difficult when it is in LED lighting condition or low lighting condition. So that is where Synergy, we found in our experience, fares much better when it comes to low lighting condition or LED lighting condition, because of this violet blocking technology that they use in their IOLs. So another thing is the distance. So now comparing Synergy with the previous IOLs from J&J, that is Tecnis Multifocal IOL and Tecnis Symphony IOL. Tecnis Multifocal IOL, on one hand, it basically gives good distance and near vision, as I mentioned earlier, but there is lack of intermediate zone. It is pupil independent in design. Tecnis Symphony, it gives continuous vision across all ranges. But the main problem with Symphony was that it did not fare well for near distances. And with the Indian population, we know that they are very quantitatively very demanding in nature. So, they would complain if they're not able to see that N6 or N8 line, which was a problem with Symphony. So that is where I feel Synergy fares much better, combining the technology of the two. That is the multifocal as well as Symphony, and giving a good near vision, as well as adding on all the advantages of Symphony, that is chroma-aligned to decrease the chromatic aberrations, which we could see in further slides. So continuous vision across all ranges basically is something which is the unique feature I feel with this IOL. So majority of the patients, they fare well for all zones, that is distance, intermediate, and near, with performance between 2020 and 2025. So that is one place, which I feel that when I compare it to other IOLs, if we see the central, visible zone, Synergy fares much better, when I compare it to other IOLs as well. So this is basically chroma-aligned technology, which is patented by Synergy and J&J, which they use on their Symphony platform as well as Synergy platform. which is basically it compensate for the corneal chromatic aberrations by this technology and gives far superior contrast and color vision. Okay, so again, high contrast, lesser spherical aberrations, lesser chromatic aberrations. So far, we've had an experience of 54 eyes, which we've implanted with the Synergy IOL. And in my experience, it fills a big void which existed in multifocal IOL basket and is a fine balance between quantitative and qualitative aspects of vision, which our patients frequently demand. It helps in delivering N6 with very good precision and very good consistency, and is exceptional when it comes to intermediate zone of vision, which I feel is very important in today's time of people using so much of laptops and desktops and majority of work going on digital platforms. So intermediate is something I think which we all need to keep in our minds while advising our patients or helping them select IOL. So that is where I feel it does a fairly good job. We need to customize the surgery to meet the refractive goals of the patient. This will also add value to their entire experience. In our experience, we found that customization is far superior when we've combined Symphony with the femto laser assisted cataract surgery, wherein we can deliver, compensate for our SIAs and gives a good customized refractive result to the patient. It does very well. Patient selection is still the key and it cannot be completely ignored. So we need to be very mindful while selecting our patients because it is not completely devoid of glares and halos, which traditionally we have experienced in other multifocal IOLs. So still good history taking and patient selection, it still holds the key. Having said that, Synergy still gives us flexibility to give multifocality to our borderline cases. So with this, I would just want to show a case wherein we've implanted a multifocal a Synergy IOL in a patient with the previous RK surgery. So without wasting much time, I'll just we combined it with a flex, and I hope my video is visible.
Yes, sir.
So we combined it with a flax, and we also went ahead with LRI incisions with the help of femto laser assisted cataract surgery. And I'll just fast forward the video for the want of time. I've left with 1 minute. So if we see here, this is a patient who has had prior RK. Such patients are very demanding, and we are going to see more and more of such patients. This is what I call borderline cases, wherein, if carefully selected, we can deliver superior results. This patient ended up achieving a good vision of 6x6 parts with N6 unaided, and she is still in follow-up. She is very satisfied with the procedure. If we see here, we can see the RK scars also. We have done LRI also. We can see here, if you can see my cursor, the LRI did not cross the old fibrous scars, but on either side it was opened eventually to compensate for the cylindrical error also, for the corneal astigmatism as well. So that is what I mean by customization, because we still do not have a Synergy toric available. So that's it from me. I think that's the end of my time, and that was my experience.
Thank you, Dr. Ankit.
Thank you, sir.
For nice presentation. Dr. Riti, you have any comment to Dr. Ankit's presentation? And please invite the next speaker also. Dr. Riti, please invite the next speaker also.
Yes, I think we look forward to Synergy. We haven't used it as yet, but let us hope that it does fill the void which was there with the other Symphony, and even with iHands, it still remains. So let us see with the new Synergy. And I now call upon Dr. Uma Sridhar to come and give her presentation, Hydrate to Heal.
Thank you, Dr. Neeti. Thank you, Dr. Ashok and Chandigarh Ophthalmic Society. I hope you can hear me and see my video. I mean, see my presentation.
Yes, and no, you
You're
please
audible,
share your
but-
slides. We are seeing
Can
your
you-
picture.
You can see my slides. You can't?
No, we are seeing your picture. Please share your slides.
One second. Let me just see. Right. Let me see here. Audio settings. Share slides. Okay, share screen. Okay. One sir.
in the green.
One sir. ये वाला?
Yes.
So yeah.
Still not visible. madam.
Just one sec, sir. Yeah. Can you now?
No, it will not come.
Which will not come?
Will not.
Reconnect.
Your presentation is there, but not coming.
Just a minute, sir.
We are seeing your
You're seeing me, but not my
no,
presentation.
your slides are there, but they are just outlines. No pictures, no text, nothing.
Yeah, just. Yeah, you can take the next presentation. sir.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now we request Dr. Girjesh Kain to please talk on keeping cystoid macular edema at bay. Dr. Girjesh, please.
Hello.
Hello. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. My voice is coming.
Yeah, your slides are visible and you are audible, sir. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Chandigarh Ophthalmic Society and Novartis for giving me opportunity to present this presentation. Today's my talk on the the keeping cystoid macular edema at the bay. This is a Novartis presentation. So, as we know that what the cystoid macular edema is, so cystoid macular edema is primary cause to reduce the vision following by after the cataract surgery and vitreoretinal surgery. Incidence of this cystoid incidence of cystoid macular edema is the in an Indian population is compared with the 2% after the uncomplicated cataract surgery, and incidence in Indian patient with the diabetes is the 47% of eye with pre-existing diabetic retinopathy, 50% in eye with pre-existing diabetic retinopathy. So if we see the pathophysiology of this cystoid macular edema, it is the inflammation due to the surgical manipulation. This is the major cause of the cystoid macular edema development. And for that, the classification of cystoid macular is angiographic cystoid macular edema or clinical cystoid macular edema. Angiographic cystoid macular edema is more common than the clinical cystoid macular edema. If we compare to the classified to the different levels, so level 1, level 2, level 3, and level 4. When the edema is involved less than the 360 degree peripheral areas, level 1 and level 2 is involved as peripheral area along the edema over there, that the moderate and the severe. Angiographic cystoid macular is the mostly asymptomatic. If we compare the classification as per the onset, it's acute, late, chronic, and recurrent. Acute cystoid macular edema within the 4 months of surgery, which is the most commonest cystoid macular edema during after some complicated and uncomplicated surgery. If you compare that at clinical presentations, if you compare to the signs and symptoms, so signs, there is a foveal edema. Basically, it's a retinal thickness more than 300 micrometer. If we compare to the symptoms is visual acuity, which is loss of decrease in visual acuity, loss of contrast sensitivity, metamorphosia. And the sign and symptoms of the clinical significant cystoid macular edema develop within the 2 week to 14 to 12 weeks after the surgery. It's approximately in the 4 weeks. So we compare the risk factor of cystoid macular edema for systemic disease, pre-existing ocular conditions, intraoperative complications. These are the main cause of the cystoid macular edema. If you compare the risk factor of cystoid macular edema, it's definitely a systemic disease. Patient is having a diabetes mellitus, systemic hypertension. These are the more prone patients to develop cystoid macular edema. If we compare for diabetes and hypertension, diabetic retinopathy is the more commonest cause of that develop the cystoid macular edema. If we compare the risk factor of cystoid macular edema in pre-existing ocular conditions like retinal vein occlusion, glaucoma, uveitis, even the vitreoretinal interface changes in subretinal activity membrane. If we compare the risk factor of cystoid macular edema intraoperative complications, so it might be due to posterior capsular rupture, trauma, vitreous loss, intraocular lens dislocation, interactive vitreous incision, iris fixation, cortical remnant, and the premature posterior capsular trauma. So most commonest, as I earlier said, the commonest cause of cystoid macular edema is the diabetes, one of the most important risk factors to develop the cystoid macular. So if you compare the diabetes and cystoid macular edema, the patient with the diabetic post-cataract surgery increase the risk of post-surgical complication associated with the poor visual outcome. So macular changes are more likely to occur after cataract surgery in the patient with the diabetes, especially in those with the pre-existing retinopathy compared to those without diabetic retinopathy. So we say that diabetic, it is the increase the risk factor of post-operative cystoid macular edema. So in a diabetic patient, there are histological changes in retina, adhesions, and leukocytes, trigger activities, facilitative impairment, and leading to the cystoid macular edema. If you compare increase the incidence of cystoid macular edema in Indian patients with the diabetes, there's a 2.4 times increase the incidence of cystoid macular edema in the Indian patients with diabetes. If the incidence of cystoid macular edema in Indian patients with diabetes and with or without diabetic retinopathy. So we compare for that there is a similar, almost a similar incidence for the 2.4 incidence with these patients also. So what diagnosed the cystoid macular edema? So first that clinical finding will diagnose the cystoid macular edema. For the confirmatory, we need an imaging technique like fluorescent angiography, color photographs, OCT, and for that the OCT is widely used to detect the cystoid macular edema. We compare the management of cystoid macular edema. So for that we have a 4 options like prophylactic, preventive, surgery, and medical. Mostly we do a prophylactic prevention for the cystoid macular edema. For that prophylactic, we use a topical steroid or NSAID with the first line agent to prevent the post-operative macular edema. Prophylaxis must be considered especially for the patient having a risk factor including like diabetes, uveitis, vitreoretinal occlusion, cardiovascular, etc. So napafenib for prophylaxis. So role of napafenib in the prophylaxis management of the posterior cystoid macular edema is show the better ocular penetration than the systemic administration, highly effective, and achieve a higher aqueous level and tolerate the safety protocol. For this the Alevro, the first and only pharmacological therapy approach in India for reducing the risk of post-operative macular edema associated with the cataract surgery in the diabetic patients. So management of action, napafenib and NSAID rapidly permeate into cornea and sclera and converted into and they will reach to the required for the post-operative protection and blocks the inflammatory mediated to down the blood retinal barrier to contribute the plasma. So they reduce the posterior cystoid macular edema. Ilaglo overview is the active ingredient. It's a napafenib 3 mg per ml formulations of ophthalmic suspension containing Grungan and presentation of multi-dose vial containing 3 ml or 4 ml bottle. Routinely in our country 3 ml bottle is available. For the overview, indication for the adult, it reduces the risk of post-operative macular edema associated with cataract surgery in a diabetic patient. Prevention in the treatment of post-operative pain, inflammation associated with the cataract surgery. Doses and administration. It is a very, very safe. One drop available in a conjunctival set once a day in the beginning of 1 day prior to the cataract surgery is continued for the at least 2 months for the post-operative period is the physical ideally dose for that delivery. And doses and administration for the prevention and treatment of a pain and inflammation. For that, the one drop once a day, meaning from the 1 day prior to the cataract surgery for the 2 weeks after the post-operative surgery, which is enough to good for that. If you compare the contraindication, as it's a normal drug, the hypersensitivity of the substance for that patient who has attacked asthma and acute rhinitis, these are some contraindications for that patient. Routinely, the drug is very safe and no need to require for such contribution. And if you compare the potential convenience, powerful post-operative pain and inflammation control, unique product formulation, target a specific activity, increase retention time, enhance the viability, and most important thing, once a daily dose. So the compliances of patients is very, very good. Once a daily dosing, it is a safe and easy to the patient for the level. The potential and convenience is a pro-drug, target is specific and better viability. Nepafenic, and it is converted into particularly for the stiffest way. Enhance the corneal penetration of the nepafenic. It is a drug which enhances the blood-brain barrier and enhance the penetration.
Grijesh, we will have to summarize because we have one more presentation, please.
Clinically evidence, so nepafenic is 0.3% after cataract surgery patient with diabetic retinopathy resulting 2 randomized study. We compare the study for that. Both the studies, there is nothing to be significant for that. There is a better viability, better penetration, better effect. So if we compare for that any other product to prevent for safety and for cystoid macular defect is a very good drug. So for limitations, the best corrected visual acuity for that patient reaches within a 4 months. So what the study adds? This is a study proved the evidence supporting the benefit of using NSAID prophylactic, beginning for the first step before surgery, for the day of surgery, and continue for the rest. Just the prophylactic, it reduces the risk of post-operative macular edema, improve the best result, with no anticipated. So indication for reducing the risk of post-operative.
Please conclude.
So post-operative macular edema, is a safe drug. Elevro is a very safe drug. This is a Novartis presentation, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Grijesh. I think because of shortage of time, we directly go on to the next presentation by Dr. Uma Sridhar. Dr. Uma, please log on.
Yeah, can he stop sharing so that I can start?
Dr. Grijesh, please stop sharing.
Yes, I stopped sharing.
Okay, sir.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, can you see it, sir, now?
Yes. Yeah.
Now you can see my screen?
Make it slideshow now.
Yes, sir. Now you can see, sir?
Yeah, we are seeing.
Yeah, thank you so much. I will not keep you waiting since we are at the end of a long day.
No problem. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. For Chandigarh Ophthalmic Society, Dr. Ashok Sharma and Dr. Chintan Malhotra. We have heard about the multifocal IOLs in the previous talk, but the patient still may be very unhappy post-LASIK or cataract surgery. And we find that with increased age group, like you can see from 66 to 75 years, the most common age group for phaco, up to 100% you may be having dry eye symptoms. Now, refractive surgeons also consider dry eye as their most common complication, if you can call it so, after LASIK surgery. Patient may keep complaining of irritation, even of fluctuating vision. And it could be very chronic, and it may take up to 3 months for the T-bud and Schirmer's to stabilize. Now, a considerable number can experience post-LASIK. It may take even 1 year to improve. So what are the factors which cause the dry eye? Now, it is known that desiccation, epithelial damage, short T-bud, and friction seem to be the 4 main causes. So let's take them one by one. Desiccation. So what happens? Post-LASIK, you know that when the flap is cut, there's disruption of the intracorneal nerve fibers. The intercorneal, that is the subbasal nerve plexus, is cut. The goblet cells are damaged by suction. There's an alteration in the corneal shape. Due to the disruption of the nerve fibers, there's decreased sensitivity, decreased blink rate, increased evaporation, and also reduced meibomian secretion. Due to damage to goblet cells, there is altered mucin, decreased tear secretion. Due to alteration of the shape, there is a decreased corneal tear stability, and so there is desiccation or dry eye. Now again, post-LASIK, there seems to be, when you see PRK versus LASIK, there seems to be more decrease in tear secretion after LASIK as versus the PRK. Now, when we see post-cataract surgery, one thing I could never understand was when 20 years ago we were doing ECCE and also ICCE with huge sutures, 8-0 sutures, patient never seems to complain about anything. Now, maybe because they couldn't see for a long time, that was their primary concern. Now the patient sees very well. First day they are 6/6 N6 with all these premium IOL. Now then, but still they are very unhappy. So there is a surface irregularity at the incision site. There is disruption of the tear film stability. There is nerve damage, even though it's just 2 millimeters. And there is a disruption in the corneal lacrimal gland loop, and that leads to dryness. There is also epithelial damage. And you also find that post-LASIK also there is increase in corneal staining. Now you also find when we are dealing with these two conditions, post-LASIK and post-cataract, there could be impairment of wound healing, and because this dryness can lead to increased epithelial permeability, loss of cytoskeletal structures. We are also doing a thesis here and then comparing superior to temporal incision. So here also you can see that when the number of cases, like 5 cases of superior incision grouped and single plane, dry eye was 2 dry eyes versus 3 non-dry eye. In fact, 2 of the 5 patients had dryness. When you had a temporal section, 5 out of the 8 had dry eye. And when you had a temporal superior, temporal incision versus superior, you found that it was a little lesser there. So the site of incision is also very important as to the amount of dryness that happens. Post-operatively, also you find that it takes a very long time for the center. I mean, the corneal thickness also may take a little time to come, and also the central epithelial thickness may take a little time to come back to normal. There is also shorter tear breakup time in both post-LASIK and post-cataract surgery. Post-LASIK, because of decreased meibomian gland secretion, disruption of the nerves, decreased sensitivity, so decreased blink rate, increased evaporation. And as we saw, we are just repeating that, altered, there is damage to goblet cells, altered mucin expression, and there is a decreased tear stability. And the breakup time also falls. So in different age groups, you can see that almost the post-cataract surgery and post-LASIK surgery, we seem to be going one to the other. So we see that the TBUT is also less post both these procedures. Friction, now the other component which is not mentioned in this slide thing is that it's not only LASIK and cataract. Nowadays, post-pandemic, I mean, during the pandemic, we are having a lot of people working from home, and they also have long hours of screen time. So 10 to 12 and 14 hours of screen time. They also have decreased blinking, and so decreased meibomian secretion rate. So as we found that there is less mucin, there is loss of basal nerve plexus, there is also less tear film stability, and TBUT is decreased. So post-cataract surgery, a lot of patients in their own language will say, chipchipahat bahut hai, a lot of stickiness. And then we are scared to touch their eyelids. So they don't clean their eyelids post-surgery, and you find there's a lot of meibomian secretion. And when you are giving Predfort, that is prednisolone acetate, which has got a lot of suspensions, all that also goes and blocks your meibomian glands. So not only physiologically that is happening post-cataract surgery, also because of your treatment and that the patient is not able to clean the glands, there is a lot of problem with the meibomian gland secretion. So the tear osmolarity may increase. So the impact of dry eye on surgical outcomes, a patient may have very good vision, but we have often had patients come and tell us, "Meri to aankh barbad ho gayi," and you are like, you're looking at 6/6 N6, and then when the patient says, "I am devastated," you are also devastated, because this is all the. Then you have to pay attention. You have done flats, you have done synergy, you have done trifocals, and you are very satisfied with your cataract procedure, but the patients may have abnormal wound healing, persistent epithelial defects, and a very prolonged recovery. So you find that unsatisfied patients, they were having the OSDI scores and the SHI scores were very high there. So what is the solution? Obviously, I have no financial interest in this presentation. So in this study that they have shown that this drug, that is sustained hydration, addresses every single one of the factors that we discussed: desiccation, epithelial damage, short T-butt and friction, by hydration, epithelial regeneration, augmented protection, and lubrication. So sustained hydration has heal factors: hydration, regeneration, augmented protection, and lubrication. So we found, like in your previous one, the Ilevro, you have the HP Guar, which seems to be their USP there, the sodium hyaluronate, boric acid, polyethylene glycol, and propylene glycol. So here the hyaluronic acid is a naturally occurring viscoelastic hydrophilic polymer and with shear thinning property and attaching to the epithelium. HP Guar is a viscous mucomimetic polymer. So in the tear film, we know that it is a very complex structure. You have the mucin layer, and then to the mucin, the HP Guar acts, and it preferably binds to the damaged or hydrophobic region, and it compensates for mucin deficiency. So as we saw in LASIK, we were having goblet cell loss there, and the hyaluronic acid seems to bind to the ocular surface and trap 1,000 times its weight in water, providing the necessary hydration. The HP Guar acts by interacting with lipid components in the tear film, decreases evaporation, and may increase tear film stability. So you have a mucomimetic, and you also have a hygroscopic structure. So it enhances the hydration, decreases friction. There is a long retention time and re-epithelialization and cell and barrier protection. Now we find that even I have used sustained hydration. I have no financial interest, but to me, who was a mild kind of dry eye, maybe perimenopausal dry eye, I just need to put once or twice a day, and I'm all set for the day. Apart from, even though if I would be on the operating microscope throughout the day, it seems to help. Again, no financial interest. So the desiccation protection is by the HA trapping 1,000 times its weight in water, the HP Guar decreasing tear evaporation, and this combination resulting in the formation of effective moisture layer, providing greater cell stability after desiccation versus just polymer alone. And the desiccation protection, it was found here, you can see that the hyaluronic acid HP Guar is much higher protection after desiccation. And also the loss of the epithelial cell regeneration is faster. So for the epithelial damage, the hyaluronic acid is an anionic mucopolysaccharide, which is a key component in the extracellular matrix and plays an important role in cell proliferation, anti-inflammation, and wound repair. And as we saw in the previous slide, that there was more viable cells preserved with HA with HPG as compared to control HPG alone or HA alone. And also the cell and barrier protection from surfactant insult was also better. And it also decreases the inflammatory response and friction and promotes epithelial healing. Now the study found the greatest epithelialization with this combination as compared to any other hyaluronic acid. And also they found that the healing of the epithelium and the fluorescent staining was much lesser in the combined group. HP Guar also increases the retention time, it increases the tear breakup time, improves the hydration, provides moisture retention, it interacts with the lipid components of the tear film. So we find that then by interacting with the lipid components, it decreases the tear evaporation, increases tear film stability, significantly improves the breakup time, allows easy blinking. The duopolymer significantly encourages lubrication and the spread of demulcents. So we find significantly lesser friction, and in conclusion, we find that dry eye is common following LASIK, cataract surgery, affects patient satisfaction. There is desiccation, epithelial damage, short T-butt and friction damage, but the heal factors are effective against desiccation, damage, shorter T-butt and friction, and the sustained hydration has healing factors. So it's better to give before and 8 weeks following surgery so that your LASIK and cataract patients are happy campers. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Uma, for excellent presentation. I think due to shortage of time, we'll not be able to take up any questions. I thank Dr. Riti Saini, my co-chairperson, Dr. Harpreet, moderator, and all the speakers for excellent presentations in this session. Thank you very much. And
thank you, sir.
We have now time for the next session, please.
Thank you,
Dr. Uma.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.